With some gratuitous extemporaneousness, the vicissitudes of a defile along the howl and hiss and boil of the river of which we give the Nomos economics. So originarily we have this notion of the Nomos as in contradistinction to the world or physis, or what comes forward by itself. Uh, so that covers both law and money. So on the side of money, so we want to go into an account. Mostly, my concernment is, or my preoccupation is the current situation, and this we have to shadow back into the history just to give ourselves more purchase on the current situation. So there's something which I would say, if we take the Straussian side, there's a family. The family in the pre-Greek world is formed around the hearth, where there's a hearth god called the Lares. This is the god that leads back to the literal origin of human beings through the father of the father of the father of the father, and so on. Then in the pre philosophic time, you get a slide away from this belief. The elites start to challenge this belief, and then you get the notion finally of the economicus, or the household, which is basically like an estate, and it's like in the Roman terms it would be a domos with its own orchards and vineyards, and basically a self-supporting unit. So the break with economics understood in the ancient way comes really only after Hobbes and David Petty prepare the notion of political economy, which essentially means that the households are involved in a nexus or network, so that there's an interdependence. So that essentially the Roman domus, for instance, would be basically independent, make their own wine, their own olive oil, their own food crops, and they're basically there's not a question of what comes in the strong sense in Adam Smith. So what I want to point out here is Adam Smith is still uh, in this Straussian and traditional set, where he defines political economy according to the Platonic notion that the statesman has or the lawmaker has is taxed with the duty of making the citizens better. And this you would do by making the best of the needs and making the best of allowing the citizen to acquire their needs and wants through economic activity, and then over on top of that, funding the state. So this is defined explicitly in the Wealth of Nations. Addendum to that, we have to mention, or let's say it's kind of saving clause to that. One will know that Adam Smith is often in contradistinction to this, sort of a sacred cow of libertarian thinking, because he has been in an essay which is no longer extant and which didn't say what it seems to say so far as all his other texts would suggest. He's the origin of the phrase the minimal state, which was then, and he gives some a small account of it, which seems to accord with what was later developed by Nozick et al. But this stands against what I just mentioned from is actually existing work, The Wealth of Nations. The Wealth of Nations then corresponds to, but in a tweet, Adrian Vermeule was referring to as the majestic phrases from the beginning of the American order, such as the general welfare. So the general welfare mentioned in the preamble corresponds basically to what Adam Smith is pointing to, and this is a matter of pragma or ethics, where the words are mixed up with the notion of ethos. Um, the development after this is towards some form of inductive um, um, political economy, away from ethos driven or statesman driven. The statesman is supposed to improve the citizens driven theory, away from normative theory as it's now called, towards a theory which would merely give law-like explanations of the workings of economics, so such as in the case of the Phillips curve, or which is attempting to say there's always this law-like relationship between unemployment and inflation, such as in the cases. And so this was led into by people like Ricardo and Malthus. Later on, the English made it more explicit and said we're not supposed to damn or praise what's happening, but make this into a science, not a pragmatic issue, not an ethical issue. There was a bite back against that by the Germans, by the Prussians, and that's the basic gist of it. You could go into all kinds of details about the physiocrats and development of different schools and so on, but basically that's the gist of it. And then we get to Weber and Simmel, who are determined by Nietzsche in the fact-value distinction, and the current operative economics is summed up by the marginalists, who are the Austrians, and all other schools of economics are effectively just talk. They're not what's actually in power. So the Austrian school is controlled by the notion of price teleology, and this means that if prices are low, that's a green light, you buy. If prices are high, that's a red light, you don't buy. Their notion and what they're concerned with relation to inflation. So I'm trying to touch on this issue, which comes into all the furor, misguided as I believe it to be, about Bitcoin and about some other things. What their issue is basically, they think that manipulation of the money supply is only one issue. Milton Friedman puts all the emphasis on that. But manipulation of the course of the economy, say in the recent, say just now with the COVID relief checks, their issue is the misdirection of labor and resources, so that people get a lot of extra money, they spend it on things they wouldn't usually spend it on. People open businesses in those sectors. Those businesses are then later on found to be defunct because people only spend it when they're on a lark or something, or various other ways of misdirecting funds. They think the main issue is misdirection of labor and entrepreneurial activity, so that they're not particularly, their main worry is not the depression or not the collapse of the currency. So on that issue, I'd say, one, it strikes me the Bitcoin thing, it's always spoken about as though it weren't a fiat currency. I was kind of shocked when I brought myself to the conclusion that it's just a fiat currency like the other currencies are. Of course, but they actually admit that, but they seem to skirt around that. Two, this notion of the 21 quadrillion satoshis or whatever, these micro units of bitcoins would be being a limited feature is, in my view, meaningless. And it doesn't matter that if you look at, say, for instance, that Twilight Zone episode about gold. Remember, gold is only worth what it's worth in certain circumstances. And the reason, so I think one of the big general misconceptions, and it's pushed especially, it's pushed everywhere. It's pushed by Max Kaiser on RT. It's pushed by, what's that guy's name, Ben Shapiro. It's pushed by, but not just the right-wing sites, but it's pushed all over, is this idea that there's supposed to be some terrible thing about coming off the gold standard as though it were original sin. This is just pure absurdity. One thing, the reason why one went off the gold standard is because what was happening is all the gold was funneling from around the world into America in the period of from 1920 to the crash. And it was because America had a big, we're importing a lot more goods to other countries. And then what would happen is the other countries would, people would get scared because, oh, there's not enough gold in central bank to support the currency, and currencies would start to crash. And then this would affect the whole, then you found out there's a world system, the economic nexus was worldwide. And so there were various attempts to stabilize this. So finally in 1972, the reason Nixon decoupled from the gold standard is precisely to insulate himself from the world system, so that when Turkey, as it always does, collapses, it wouldn't affect the American economy. That was the reason for going off the gold standard, and it was probably a good reason. Another thing I'd say is, and there's no going back to the gold standard, it was always a bad idea, and it was never very strong. Okay, so this is running low, but that's the best I can do for the moment, but I have a lot of other notions on the current general misconceptions of what's going on in economics, which that does not sufficiently substantiate.